to say, Sasha, how could you do this to me? A 15-year-old's Moscow diary, how can I compete with that? Oh, it was fantastic, it was wonderful. And there's no way I can do that. Not only has he done that to me, but a large part of the beginning of my talk is about one Pavel Litvinov. And here he is to correct everything I say, to make sure that I don't distort anything or tell any lies. I had no idea he was going to be here. I'm delighted he's here, but I'm not sure we're going to agree, but I hope so. In any case, this is not an academic paper. It's not quite as unacademic as Olga's, but it's unacademic. It's impressionistic, it's discursive, and it's anecdotal. And the idea I have is to put flesh on the bones of these words, Samizdat and Tamizdat, and perhaps to describe some of the cogs and wheels that go into play to transform one into the other. I should also say that this form of Tamizdat that I'm discussing is that which is translated into English. In other words, it's not true Tamizdat in the sense that it's the original language where it's being printed abroad, but translated into English. So Tam in this case means England. And what I'm going to discuss is what we translated and published in the magazine Index on Censorship, which has been mentioned twice already this morning, and I'm very flattered. Also, part of the story I have to tell has been partly told, so you can believe this is a really bad day for me. In any case, first thing to say, I think, is that the case of Index is unique because the magazine was itself a direct product of Samizdat, Tamizdat nexus. Let me explain. The original inspiration for Index was a message from two prominent Soviet dissidents, Pavel Litvinov, need I say, grandson of the former Soviet foreign minister Maxim Litvinov, and Larissa Bogoraz, former wife of the writer Yuli Daniel, who wrote to the London Times in 1968 calling for international condemnation of the rigged trial of two young writers and their typists on charges of anti-Soviet agitation and propaganda. How familiar that charge is to the people in this room, I think. One of the writers was Alexander Ginsberg, the other Yuri Galanskov, both probably also known to you. Unfortunately, Galanskov died tragically in a camp some 3 years later after that letter. The English poet and former co-editor of Encounter, Stephen Spender, organized and published a telegram of support for Pavel and Larissa's telegram. They were supported by 16 well-known British and US public intellectuals. I won't name them all, but they included W.H. Auden, A.J. Ayer, Yehudi Menuhin, J.B. Priestley, Paul Schofield, Henry Moore, Bertrand Russell, and Igor Stravinsky. A fair spread of the arts and of eminence in the arts. In reply, Litvinov suggested starting some form of organization, I quote, to provide information to world public opinion about the real state of affairs in the USSR, by which he meant, of course, the ongoing censorship, the trials, and the imprisonment of Soviet writers and intellectuals. He stipulated, and this is very important, that this new organization be politically impartial and draw attention to similar abuses in right-wing dictatorships as well. I quote, "Of course, this committee should not have an anti-communist or anti-Soviet character. It would even be good if it contained people who were persecuted in their own countries for pro-communist or independent views, as for example in Greece. The point is not that this or that ideology is not correct, but that force not be used to demonstrate its correctness." Spender and his group of British intellectuals and artists managed to collect enough funds together to found a non-profit organization called Writers and Scholars International. Meanwhile, they advertised for someone to run this organization, and in the end, I was hired as the director and told to put Pavel's letter into effect in whatever way I chose. Luckily, I was better prepared than I realized at the time. I was a hard-up freelance translator at that moment, rapidly falling behind the cost of living. Although I'd translated Nabokov, Tolstoy, Dostoevsky. The point here is that my latest translation was of My Testimony by Anatoly Marchenko. This, I didn't bring the book because it's too heavy, but anyway, that was the first publication in English of the book. The book created quite a sensation, not only because its author was a working man, although a very intelligent working man, not an intellectual, and also because it was the first extended contemporary account of life in a Soviet labor camp. That is, life as it was being lived at that very moment. Both my translation and the Russian original were published in 1969, a year after Pavel's letter and a year before I started my new job. And it prompted a wave of publicity about the Soviet judicial system and its human rights violations that also caught my attention. It's not that I was ignorant of these things before, it's that the very immediacy and of that book and the document really turned me on, as I might say. Litvinov had also described the trial of Andrei Sinyasky and Yulia Daniel, Larissa Bogoraz's former husband, as the stimulus that triggered both the dissident movement in the Soviet Union and his letter. I had actually been to Moscow shortly before and had met Sinyasky and Daniel before their arrest. And this again brought an immediacy that I would not have felt before. Marchenko had in fact devoted a long chapter of his book to Yulia Daniel, who was in the same camp as he was. And in his preface, Marchenko had echoed Litvinov's plea. This, by the way, Marchenko was before I had been selected to run this organization. I'd like this evidence of mine concerning the Soviet camps and prisons for political prisoners to come to the attention of humanists and progressive people in other countries, those who also stick up for political prisoners in Greece and Portugal and in Spain and Africa. So far as I know, and Pavel can confirm this or not, Litvinov's and Marchenko's appeals were made independently of one another. But they show how important this idea of political neutrality was to them and how current it was in dissident circles. The reason, I think, and Pavel can clarify this maybe, was their desire to forestall the KGB and the Soviet authorities for branding the dissidents as stooges of the CIA or simply pawns in the Cold War. Litvinov also referred in his letter, I should add, to another persecuted dissident at that time, Vladimir Bukovsky, whose first trial Litvinov was attending and taking notes on. After several stints in jail, labor camps, and insane asylum, as we know, Bukovsky was deported to England and wrote his own memoir, To Build a Castle, which I translated as well. It wasn't published directly under Index's auspices, because Index existed by then, but it did strike me, slightly superstitious, as the translation somehow completed the circle first begun by Litvinov. But let me get back to Index. I had no program, very little money, and no resources to fall back on. I knew that whatever we undertook would have to be cheap and able to be carried out by one or at most two persons. There was no internet in those days, of course, and I decided that given my own interests, the simplest and best way to realize our mission would be to start some sort of a publication. I managed to overlook the fact that publication meant printing costs, paper costs, distribution costs, not to speak of the cost of collecting information, translating it, and editing on. But with the help of the committee, we raised just enough money to make a start. I brought a couple of early issues in to show you what it looked like. But before that, let me just say that I didn't obviously have to work alone. I was reminded by Siobhan's and Irina's presentations this morning of that network of human rights and academic specialists who already existed and were already taking interest in the Soviet repressions and the dissident movement. And just to mention a few of them, they were stationed either in the London School of Economics, which is where Peter Redaway, known to many of you, was. Peter was also on the board of Index. There was the BBC as a source, very important source, the School of Slavonic Studies, and especially Amnesty International. These were the very early days of human rights, and Amnesty had been started about 7 years beforehand, and they were extremely important to us. The issue was, however, what would be our unifying theme? From the start, we had to deal with countries from various parts of the world, and it was obvious that this had to be a human rights magazine and somehow politically impartial. So I settled on censorship as a way to examine the suppression of human rights wherever that suppression occurred. It seemed to me, first of all, it was the precondition for any kind of democratic regime. And secondly, it was a universal problem. I'll try to skip forward a bit because I can see this, I mustn't talk too much about the magazine. In any case, we started the magazine, and I did bring, this was the very first issue. By the way, I didn't know about I didn't know how to do PowerPoint, so I can't put these things there. But I brought it also just to show you how we approached this. There were two prose poems by Alexander Solzhenitsyn, a poem by George Seferis, a censored Greek writer, a piece by Milovan Djilas, the Yugoslav politician who was in disgrace, others from writers in Portugal, a piece about Bangladesh, a letter from George Margakis, a famous figure in Greece, 14 poems by Natalia Gorbanevskaya, and so on and so forth. This, as I say, was the first. A later one, just to show you how it changed. And this one was, a very large part was devoted. It was Solzhenitsyn and Sakharov, complete texts. And it was the texts of various writers, various protests and letters that each of them had written, along with more information about the dissident movement. Well, another issue that came up, which again was mentioned, I think in fact, I'm sure by Irina and Siobhan this morning, was the whole question of what to put in the magazine. That is to say, we had the political aspect of it, the social and political aspect, the censorship act of political activists, dissidents, journalists was there. But we had to do, I felt, something more than that. And so that something more was the idea of introducing literature to the magazine. As you've seen from the beginning, we had poems by Gorbanevskaya and by Seferis. And we spent a lot of time not only looking for, we were looking for literature to begin with, but then it began to flow of its own accord. But before I go on, I want to show you a couple more, because this shows you the importance of Pavel. When Pavel actually, this is his account of the dissident movement, his account of the dissident movement. And we also published in this issue a copy of the letter that he had sent to us. To give you another example of the broadness of the magazine, two big stories on the front page were South Africa and the USSR. I'll come back to some of these other things in a moment. So the one problem about this was, sorry, I'm getting ahead of myself here. Oh, there's the question of the literature. In fact, Stephen Spender had raised this question at the very beginning when he wrote in our first issue, obviously there's a risk of a magazine of this kind becoming a bulletin of frustration. However, the material by writers which is censored in Eastern Europe, Greece, South Africa, and other countries is among the most exciting that is being written today. Well, he was prescient in this respect because we ended up publishing a very large number of famous writers from South America, from Asia, and other parts of the world, as well as from the Soviet bloc. But I will just limit myself to some of the people we did publish, which included Alexander Solzhenitsyn, of course, Andrei Sinyavsky, Milan Kundera, who was discussed a lot this morning, Václav Havel, Stanislav Baranchak, and many, many others. Not long after the magazine was established, Joseph Brodsky was allowed to go abroad, and Brodsky came to London. And it allowed me actually to do the first interview that he gave when he arrived in the West. I wasn't aware that this was either the first, this was the first. But what I do remember is this. I was able to reach Joseph not only because of my background, but because he was being shepherded by W.H. Auden and Stephen Spender. These were his immediate hosts there. And I remember him sitting down in our tiny one-room office, and we had an interview. And the one thing I remember is I kept linking him to the dissidents and to the movement, the basically political movement. And Joseph insistently kept steering away from politics. He wouldn't answer any questions which suggested, quote, dissidents. What he wanted to talk about was poetry, which is very typical of Joseph, although he had allowed his work to circulate in Tamizdat and had actually given some of it to people to bring to the West to publish here. So not only did these famous writers lend weight index, if you like, but it was important to remember that all writers of merit deserved a hearing, and all writers that without qualification deserved to be published, especially if they were not published in their own country. But on the lighter side, I also have to confess that this diversity lent interest of a different sort, because literature of any description, although it might sound strange in the context of the suppression of human rights and censorship, provided entertainment. And it was essential, if we wanted to make any kind of impact, to get our magazine bought and circulated. I won't offer a comprehensive account of the work we did. I was editor of the magazine for 10 years, and we published, I think, about 50 pages per issue quarterly. So you can imagine how many people were involved. But I do want to mention two particular initiatives that we got involved with, one of which again was described this morning, and that was the Polish magazine Zapis, which we heard so much about this morning. The first and one of the most distinguished of the Polish underground magazines. In fact, I did bring a cover with a reference to that. Okay. Oh yes, it was this one. We had an issue and it had a great deal about Latin America in it. Latin America, you may remember, there were military regimes in Chile, Argentina, and Brazil, and in the north of the There was also quite a lot of repression, so there's plenty to write about. But at the bottom, Polish writers defy the censor, Zapis published in London. Well, first of all, we had a very large feature on the Polish Black Book, which some of you here may remember, of censorship. But we had also got involved in the real Tamizdat, publishing Zapis in London. Zapis, which means record or transcript, was the first, as I believe, the first serious example of Tamizdat to appear in Poland. It was heavily influenced by Soviet dissident practices, and it was published under the auspices of the Workers' Defense Committee. This is 1976, 1977. However, we got a message from Adam Michnik that the copies being published in Poland by one of those machines that Siobhan was describing this morning, the printing machine, an offset printer, was producing copies that were virtually unreadable. So there was all this valuable material. Stanislav Baranchak, the poet, was one of the co-editors. So Michnik asked Smolar to ask if someone in London might be able to publish this magazine in Polish. And he stipulated that it be a non-Polish organization. I'm not sure why, whether this because there were disputes and disagreements among Polish groups, or like Pavel Litvinov's original stipulation that we be impartial, that if it was published somehow by a British organization, it would give it some more defense. He mentioned this to Eugene Smolar, a Polish dissident, who was very busy in dissident circles, and by the way worked for the BBC Polish service. His brother, Alexander, was head of the service. So the point was that it should be published in London, but at the same time the editors insisted on signing their own real names to their creation. And the point was, as they openly wrote, to circumvent the censorship in Poland that prevented writers from freely expressing their ideas. Well, we continued and we published all 21 issues of the magazine Zapis, along with 4 Polish books that appeared in its pages as separate books. And this was true Tamizdat. This was at a time when we were also in touch with Irina's group in Paris and with Barbara Tarunci, and were rather amused that the magazine annex, the Polish magazine annex, seemed to rhyme with index. At least it helped me to have a good, to enjoy the coincidence. Well, by this time I had hired an emigre Czech journalist and translator, George Tyner. And George, through his contacts, opened a direct line to the dissidents in Czechoslovakia, enabling us to publish not only special issues on that country, but a one-act play by Václav Havel. Should I wind up quickly soon? All right. The following year, the Czech dissident group, headed by Havel Charter 77, was founded, and we regularly published their declarations in English. The other thing I'd like to mention is this, something that hasn't come up in this for obvious reasons in a way, but I want to mention it. And that is the question of the unofficial art that was being produced in the Soviet Union and other countries, but particularly the Soviet Union. In '76, I was also introduced to Alexander Sasha Glazer, a name I don't know if anybody recognizes. Yes? Okay. Well, Glazer was an amateur collector of unofficial art in the Soviet Union. He had amassed a large collection of officially banned paintings, but managed an amazing deal where he managed to get them out to the West. And he had come to London to see if we could possibly hold an exhibition there. He explained how the works of art had regularly been banned and destroyed. There was a famous exhibition on a vacant lot which was destroyed by bulldozers which made it into the papers. And many of the nonconformist artists have been allowed to leave and had gone to Paris. Luckily, one of our founders was Roland Penrose, also the founder and the chief director of the Institute of Contemporary Art in London. I also become friends with a dissident Russian art historian, Igor Golomstok, who was in the news at the moment because his memoir has just been translated into English. Golomstok was in favor of having an exhibition, and in January 1977, we opened an exhibition, and I have a picture of that catalog somewhere. Typically disorganized, I can't find it. I'll show it to you in a minute. In any case, we had a major exhibition which Golomstok, in his memoir, describes as the largest thus far in the West. And not only did it introduced the British public and myself and others to this bitter struggle that had been going on between the Soviet Union and artists for many, many years. There's been a great deal of scholarly work done on this in the last few years, luckily, and it shows how wide it was. In any case, for us, it was a step outside our usual circle of subjects, and produced also a huge amount of interest in the Soviet dissident movement generally. I know I've been going on a long time, and I'm going to wind up here. The other thing that helped us very much was that I was conceiving the idea of writing a biography of Alexander Solzhenitsyn at this time, and through a rather unusual set of contacts, one of which was Lev Kopylev, the friend of Solzhenitsyn's in the Sharashka. I was put in touch with Solzhenitsyn's Swiss lawyer at the time, Dr. Habe, and he asked me to arrange for publication and translation and publication of this particular little book, Letter to the Soviet Leaders. And so Index was actually, we published this as a separate book, and it was the very first translation and publication. Needless to say, we went on to do a great deal more. Well, I think other things I would like to say would have to wait for question time. The issue I haven't really tackled in this talk, which might be worth thinking or talking about, is what did it mean for Tamizdat to appear in the West in the context of Tamizdat from South America, from Greece, from Portugal, from Spain, and other countries of the world as well, because it's the most unusual setting. It means that we were less deeply drawn into the dissident movement than some of the other groups in London that were publishing work from Russia and Eastern Europe, but it did mean that we placed it in a different context and to a certain extent for a different audience. Sorry, I have to stop here.